The first document to attract the attention of the investigators from the Schrobenhausen district was not the crime scene examination report, but a receipt for the sale of kerosene, issued in the name of the farm owners several days before the discovery of the bodies. The paper was standard, with the signature of a local merchant and the shop's stamp. Yet it was precisely this document that allowed for the establishment of an exact chronology of the final farm activities at Hinterkaifeck. According to the record, the purchase was made at the end of March 1922, already after neighbors had noted a lack of visual contact with the family. This contradiction, the presence of economic activity amid the actual disappearance of the residents, became the starting point of the investigation. If you value such detailed reconstructions and documentary analyses, subscribe to the channel. This directly impacts the ability to produce similar investigations. Next to enter the case was the protocol of the postman's interrogation, which indicated that mail to the farm had stopped being collected several days before the discovery of the bodies. Yet, there were no signs of tampering with the mailbox. The testimony records an important detail. In the rural Bavaria of that period, postal service performed the function not only of delivering letters, but also of monitoring the presence of residents. A lack of response to correspondence was considered an anomaly, but not an immediate reason for intervention. The political and social context of the region in the early 20s was defined by the aftermath of defeat in the First World War and the instability of the Weimar Republic. Bavaria was an area with a high degree of autonomous thinking, where central authority was perceived as remote and often ineffective. Rural farms like Hinterkaifeck functioned as almost autonomous units. Landowners provided for their own food, had limited contact with the external market, and built an internal security system based on personal connections and reputation. According to the district tax records, the Gruber family belonged to the category of prosperous peasants. Their farm included several buildings, a cattle yard, grain reserves, and tools registered in the property inventory. Financial reports show a stable income with no signs of debt, which rules out economic motivation for external pressure from creditors. However, the interrogation protocols of the neighbors record a different line of tension. Several witnesses point to conflictual relationships within the family. In particular, a court case against the head of the household is mentioned, related to a violation of moral norms and subsequent short-term imprisonment. This information is confirmed by the district court archive, where a concluded case resulting in punishment is recorded. Thus, the internal farm power structure was unstable. Formal subordination was combined with latent conflict. Of particular significance are the testimonies given several days after the discovery of the bodies. Witnesses note strange tracks in the snow leading to the house but not returning. This element is recorded in several protocols, yet their accuracy is questionable. First, the interrogations were conducted after the site had already been partially disturbed by neighbors. Second, weather conditions in late March could have significantly altered the structure of the snow cover. Nevertheless, the very fact of the repeated mention indicates a persistent perception of a threat, recorded even before the events. An additional source is the testimony of the master of the house himself, relayed through third parties. Several days before the family ceased to exist, he complained about sounds in the attic. According to the reconstruction, these were footsteps or the moving of objects. In the conditions of wooden architecture, such sounds could have been caused by temperature changes, but the combination of factors, tracks in the snow, the disappearance of the house key, recorded in one of the interrogations, points to the possible presence of an outsider. The mechanics of responding to such signals in rural Bavaria were limited. The police operated on the principle of response, not preventative control. Without a direct crime report, intervention was considered excessive. Thus, the potential trespassing on the farm's property remained outside of official attention. Archival materials also record a change of the maid shortly before the events. The previous servant left the farm, citing a fear of unexplained sounds. This testimony is included in the record. However, the investigation did not assign it priority, classifying it as subjective perception. A new maid was hired shortly before the tragedy, creating a temporal coincidence important for analyzing access to the internal structure of the house. From the point of view of institutional vulnerability, the farm represented an object with a minimal level of access control. The absence of secure perimeters, reliance on personal vigilance, and isolation created conditions under which the prolonged hidden presence of an outsider was technically possible. Outbuildings, including the barn and attic, provided space for concealment without immediate detection. A critical analysis of the sources shows that a significant portion of the evidence was obtained only after information about the incident had spread throughout the district. This creates an effect of retrospective construction. Witnesses may have adapted their testimonies to the known facts, emphasizing elements that seemed significant. For example, mentions of footprints in the snow appear in several versions with varying details, indicating possible memory distortion. Nevertheless, the body of documents allows for a key conclusion to be established. Prior to the discovery of the bodies, economic activity inconsistent with the family's condition was taking place on the farm. Someone continued to maintain the operation of the property, feeding the livestock, using the kitchen, controlling resources. This fact is confirmed not only by testimony but also by indirect data. The condition of the animals and the absence of signs of neglect. Thus, at the first stage of the investigation, a model is formed in which the Hinterkaifeck farm appears not simply as a crime scene, but as a temporarily controlled territory. The person exercising this control possessed sufficient knowledge of the farmstead and access to its infrastructure. The question of how this access was obtained, through external penetration or internal connections, remains open and requires further analysis. By the time the investigative team first conducted a systematic inspection of the Hinterkaifeck farm territory, the key document was not so much the body discovery protocol, but the inventory of seized items, compiled in the first hours after the gendarmerie's arrival. It records tools, farm records, keys, as well as an item designated as a heavy agricultural implement with signs of recent use. The wording avoids direct qualification, however. Further comparisons show that it referred to an item used for the physical suppression of the victims. It is noteworthy that this tool was not ultimately found at the scene. Its position and subsequent disappearance from the controlled zone remain subjects of discrepancies in the reports. Within the structure of the documents, the schematic layout of the buildings holds a special place. According to the plan, the farm was a closed complex, a residential house connected to a barn, a cattle yard, and utility rooms. This architectural solution, typical for the Upper Bavaria region, created an internal circuit where movement between zones could occur without exiting outside. Thus, a person who gained access inside could move throughout the entire complex without leaving external traces. According to neighbors' testimonies, the first alarming signals after the family ceased to exist were indirect signs: the children's absence from school, uncollected milk, and failure to attend church service. However, Intervention occurred only several days later when one of the neighbors arrived at the farm with 2 witnesses. Their testimonies record an important detail. The front door was not broken into, but opened without a key. This indicates either the use of a spare access point or that the locking mechanisms had not been fully engaged. The inspection report states that the bodies were discovered not in the living quarters, but in the barn section. This circumstance requires separate analysis. According to the reconstruction, the victims were successively brought into the utility room area where their elimination took place. Such an order rules out spontaneous actions. It suggests either sequential luring or forced relocation in the absence of immediate resistance from the others. The key element becomes the temporal sequence. Forensic medical records, despite the limited methods of that period, indicate a gap in time between the cessation of existence of the first and the last victims. This is indirectly confirmed. Signs of subsequent kitchen use, food preparation, and livestock care were discovered in the house. Thus, the person controlling the farm remained on site for at least several days. An important source are the reports on the condition of the animals. The veterinarian involved in the inspection noted that the livestock had been fed and cared for during the period after the presumed date of the owner's elimination. This observation is recorded in an official document and is not contested. Consequently, the actions to maintain the farm were regular and required basic skills. This rules out a random outsider unfamiliar with agricultural work. The mechanics of presence at the farm are reconstructed based on indirect data. In particular, the protocol mentions the absence of some keys previously in the family's possession. This coincides with testimonies about a missing key several days before the events. Thus, access to the premises could have been secured in advance without the need for a break-in. The question of information transfer deserves separate attention. Despite the lack of evidence for the existence of an organized group, a number of circumstances point to possible knowledge of the farm's internal layout. For example, the sequence of moving the victims and the use of internal passageways suggest familiarity with the floor plan. This knowledge could have been obtained either through prolonged observation or through personal contacts. Interrogation protocols record several versions concerning possible participants. However, their analysis shows a high degree of inconsistency. Some witnesses point to specific individuals from among the family's acquaintances, but their testimonies are often based on rumors and are not supported by material evidence. Moreover, some interrogations were conducted under pressure, which reduces the reliability of the information. In one instance, a witness changed his testimony several days later, citing a perceptual error. From the standpoint of institutional response, the investigation encountered a number of limitations. First, the crime scene was not immediately isolated. Before investigators arrived, the farm was visited by neighbors, relatives, and random individuals. This led to the loss of some traces and distortion of the initial picture. Second, coordination between the local gendarmerie and district structures was insufficient. Documents show delays in information transfer and a lack of a unified method for recording evidence. The financial aspect was also examined. According to the inventory of property, a significant portion of valuables remained in place. Money, farm records, tools, none of this was taken. This allows us to rule out a material gain motive as the primary one. However, the inventory notes the absence of certain small items, the significance of which was not clarified. Perhaps they had a functional value for the person who was at the farm. A critical audit of the sources reveals another problem: the discrepancy between primary and secondary reports. The primary protocols, drawn up in the first days, are more restrained and record only observable facts. Later documents, including press publications and additional interrogations, contain elements of interpretation that are not always supported by the original data. For example, the claim of a constant presence of an outsider in the attic prior to the events lacks direct documentary confirmation and is based on hearsay. Nevertheless, the totality of the data allows for the reconstruction of a basic sequence. The person who had access to the farm entered several days before the events. They used the utility rooms as a shelter, moved within the complex, and controlled resources. The elimination of the victims occurred sequentially, utilizing the space of the barn. After this, the person remained on the territory, maintaining the farm's operations, indicating a lack of haste and confidence in not being discovered immediately. The reasons for the failure to solve the case are linked to several factors. First, the lack of clear initial crime scene documentation in the first hours. Second, the limited technical capabilities of forensics at the time. Third, the high degree of the property's isolation, which precluded the presence of independent observers. As a result, the investigation relied primarily on circumstantial data and testimonies of uneven reliability. By the end of the second stage of the investigation, a stable hypothesis had formed. The events at the farm were not a spontaneous act, but rather a controlled operation with prearranged access and subsequent holding of the territory. However, the lack of direct evidence identifying the perpetrator and the loss of some evidence prevented this hypothesis from being translated into a legally significant indictment. By the third stage of the investigation, when the initial inspection was complete and systematic work with testimonies had begun, a document of a different nature appeared in the archive, a comparative table of interrogations compiled by the district investigator. It lists, row by row, key statements from witnesses: who saw lights in the windows, who heard noises, who noted movements of people near the farm. The very structure of the table shows that the investigation faced not a lack of information, but its excess and internal inconsistency. According to this table, the testimonies are divided into three groups. The first, direct observations made before the discovery of the bodies. The second, testimonies that emerged after information about the incident spread. The third, assumptions formed under the influence of rumors. When compared, it becomes obvious that it is precisely the second and third groups that begin to dominate in quantity but are inferior in reliability. For example, the claim about a person seen at the edge of the forest appears in several interrogations, yet the dates and descriptions of appearance diverge. In one case, it concerns a man in work clothes. In another, a person in a dark coat. The investigator notes in a remark that these testimonies cannot be reduced to a single observation. This indicates an effect typical for such investigations. After the public announcement of a crime, witnesses begin to retrospectively interpret any unusual events as related to it. Special attention is given to interrogating individuals who had access to the farm earlier. In particular, former employees, suppliers, and acquaintances of the family are being checked. One of them, interrogated in early April, gives testimony about a conflict with the owner related to payment for labor. However, further verification of financial records shows that the debt was settled several months before the events. This contradiction is recorded in the case file, and the version of a motive based on an economic conflict is dismissed as untenable. Another set of documents concerns possible internal involvement. The investigation considers the hypothesis that access to the farm could have been obtained through trusted relationships. The protocols mention individuals who visited the farmstead without prior notification. However, None of these visits coincide in time with the period preceding the tragedy. Moreover, most such visits were regular and known to the neighbors. A separate analysis is required regarding the time an outsider spent on the farm after the elimination of the residents. The kitchen inspection report indicates that food was cooked at least twice between the presumed date of the family's demise and the moment the bodies were discovered. This is confirmed by the state of the dishes and food remnants. Thus, the person present on the farm not only remained there, but also carried out routine household activities. In this context, an important document emerges: the report of the veterinary inspector, which records the livestock feeding schedule. According to its conclusion, the animals were fed regularly, without interruption, which rules out a prolonged human absence. Moreover, the feeding occurred at the usual time, indicating knowledge of the routine. This circumstance strengthens the hypothesis that the person either had prior ties to the farmstead or had observed it for a sufficiently long time. A critical audit of the sources shows that some interrogations were conducted using pressure methods characteristic of that period. In particular, one protocol records that a witness changed his testimony after a multi-hour interrogation without a break. Initially, he denied the presence of suspicious individuals, but later stated that he remembered a stranger. The investigator makes a note about the reduced reliability of this data. This is an example of how institutional practices can distort the factual picture. Simultaneously, work is being done with physical evidence. However, here the investigation encounters limitations. The lack of standardized forensic methodology leads to fingerprints found at the scene not being properly recorded. One of the reports mentions shoe prints in the barn, but their size and shape are not documented. This makes subsequent comparison with specific individuals impossible. The financial line of inquiry is finally closed after an analysis of bank records and cash found on the farm. None of the significant assets were taken. This is confirmed by an inventory drawn up in the presence of several witnesses. Thus, the motive related to material gain is excluded as the primary one. At the same time, a document appears in the archive pointing to a possible attempt to conceal traces. This concerns the movement of the bodies inside the barn. According to the report, their position did not correspond to the initial point of discovery. This could have been the result of actions by the perpetrator, or by individuals who arrived at the farm before the investigation. In the absence of precise on-site documentation, it is impossible to distinguish between these possibilities. An analysis of the logistics of movement within the complex shows that control over the territory was exercised sequentially. The person moved between the living quarters and the utility rooms using internal passages. This is confirmed by the condition of the doors and the absence of signs of forced entry. Moreover, one of the protocols notes that some doors were locked from the inside, indicating conscious control of access. By the end of this stage, the investigation forms several competing hypotheses. The first is the involvement of a person previously connected to the farm. The second is external penetration followed by the mastering of the space. The third is a combination of these factors. However, none of them receives sufficient confirmation to bring charges. The reasons for this lie not only in the loss of evidence, but also in institutional limitations. The absence of a centralized database, the impossibility of interregional information exchange, and reliance on oral testimonies create a situation in which, even in the presence of indirect coincidences, they cannot be legally formalized. Thus, by the conclusion of the investigation's third stage, a paradoxical situation forms. The mechanics of the events have been reconstructed with a high degree of accuracy, but the subject of the action remains unidentified. The Hinterkaifeck farm is considered as an isolated system, temporarily coming under the control of an unidentified person who possessed sufficient skills, resources, and time to carry out sequential actions, and subsequently leave without being recorded. The final set of documents is compiled after the active phase of the investigation is essentially completed, and the case transitions into the category of unsolved. The key source becomes the consolidated inventory of property, drawn up when the farm was transferred to administrative management. This document lists all material assets, agricultural tools, grain supplies, livestock, furniture, monetary funds, and personal belongings. Notably, the inventory records an almost complete preservation of the farmstead, except for minor items whose absence was not explained. This finally confirms the conclusion about the non-mercenary nature of the events. The same archival block contains a report on the condition of the buildings several weeks after the events. It indicates that the farm had been put in order. The premises were cleaned, some inventory was moved. However, it was not established who exactly performed these actions: the investigative authorities, the temporary managers, or third parties. The absence of clear procedural records leads to the loss of the last potential traces that could have shed light on the behavior of the person who controlled the object after the family ceased to exist. The legal formalization of the case reflects the institutional limitations of the era. The decree on the suspension of the investigation states that, due to the lack of sufficient evidence and the impossibility of establishing a specific person to be charged, further investigative actions are deemed inexpedient. This wording, typical for the criminal proceedings of that period, records the transition from an active search to archival storage. However, even at this stage, work with the materials continues. In particular, a reanalysis of testimonies obtained earlier is conducted. The investigator compares the versions, excluding those based on rumors or altered testimonies. As a result, a limited set of data with the highest degree of reliability remains. The sequential elimination of the victims in the barn, the subsequent presence of an outsider on the farm, the maintenance of economic activity, and the absence of signs of a hasty departure. A special place in the final report is occupied by a section dedicated to information leaks. It notes that information about the progress of the investigation repeatedly found its way into the local press, which influenced the behavior of witnesses. After publications, the number of testimonies increased, but their quality declined. This phenomenon is recorded as a factor that complicated the establishment of the factual picture. Critical analysis of sources in the concluding part of the case acquires a systemic character. The investigation directly points to the unreliability of a number of testimonies obtained under pressure. One of the notes states that witness assertions, altered during repeated interrogations, cannot be considered stable. This admission effectively undermines part of the previously proposed versions and leaves the case without a clearly defined circle of suspects. The issue of possible complicity is considered separately. Despite the lack of direct evidence, the investigation analyzes the probability of more than one person's involvement. Arguments in favor of this hypothesis include the complexity of the logistics and the need for simultaneous control over several zones of the farm. However, counter-arguments, the absence of traces of multiple presence, and the sequential nature of the actions lead to the conclusion of a higher probability of a single perpetrator. This conclusion is recorded as a working one without a final legal qualification. An important element of the epilogue becomes the fate of the archives. The case documents are transferred to the district repository, where they are systematized by category: protocols, material evidence, financial records, diagrams. Part of the materials is lost in subsequent years as a result of administrative reorganizations. This is confirmed by later inventory lists, where some of the originally recorded documents are missing. Thus, the reconstruction of events in subsequent decades will rely on an incomplete corpus of sources. The case's influence on the law enforcement practice of the region is recorded indirectly. Police reports in subsequent years contain instructions on the need for stricter isolation of crime scenes and standardization of evidence recording. Although no direct connection to the specific case is indicated, the chronological coincidence allows viewing the events at the farm as one of the factors that influenced the change in procedures. From the point of view of institutional analysis, the case demonstrates a combination of several vulnerabilities. The first is the isolation of the object, which allowed for prolonged covert presence. The second is the absence of preventive mechanisms for responding to threat signals. The third is insufficient coordination between different levels of law enforcement structures. The fourth is reliance on witness testimony with limited capabilities for material recording. The final reconstruction, based on the available documents, remains within a probabilistic model. The person who infiltrated the farm gained access before the start of events, used the internal infrastructure for concealment and movement, sequentially eliminated all present individuals, after which for several days maintained the operation of the farmstead. The departure from the territory occurred without being recorded, which can be explained either by a temporary window of observer absence or by the use of routes not monitored by neighbors. In the concluding paragraph of the report, the investigator records a position that will be repeatedly quoted thereafter. Given the established circumstances of the event mechanics, the absence of identification of the person who committed them does not allow the case to be concluded in a legal sense. This formulation emphasizes the gap between the reconstruction of the process and the impossibility of personalizing responsibility. Thus, the Hinterkaifeck farm remains in the archive not as an exception to practice, but as an example of the extreme load on the investigative mechanisms of its time. The documents allow for a high degree of accuracy in describing what happened and how it was implemented, but do not provide an answer to the question of who exactly gained control over the territory and left it without a trace.